we go. So we are, yeah, okay, great. We're live. Sorry about the delay. Thanks everybody for coming. My name is Lauren Bellhorn. I'm an editor at the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung, or Rosa-Luxemburg Foundation rather. And I'm hearing myself coming from several windows. Sorry about that. Yeah, so we're here today on January 15th to commemorate our namesake, the iconic socialist thinker and organizer Rosa Luxemburg. Today marks the 104th anniversary of Rosa Luxemburg's murder at the hands of proto-fascist thugs, a political assassination in the heat of the German Revolution that swept the country after World War I. Her murder and that of her comrade and collaborator Karl Liebknecht has since become one of the most important anniversaries for the socialist left in Europe and around the world. And today, as every year, thousands of socialists gathered at her grave in Berlin to commemorate her tragic loss. But at the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, we think it's important to celebrate not just, or mark not only Rosa Luxemburg's death, but more importantly, her life and her immense theoretical and practical contributions to the socialist movement, which is why we're here today for a book launch of the latest volume of her English language complete works on revolution, which I'm holding right here and which was published several months ago by Verso Books. We have 4 very respected scholars and authorities on Luxemburg's theoretical and political writings, all of whom will give presentations followed by plenty of time for questions and discussion, both among the panelists and from the audience. If there's a question you'd like to pose to the panel, simply type it in the chat and we'll make sure that the panelists see it and get a chance to respond. That's pretty much all from me. So once again, thanks to everyone who came, whether it's the middle of the day, early morning, or late at night where you are. And with that, I will hand it off to the chair of today's discussion, Peter Hudis, the editor of the complete works.
Thank you very much, Lauren, and thanks to, of course, the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation and Verso Books for making this event possible. The project to publish the complete works of Rosa Luxemburg, which obviously is a long-range and ongoing project, started about a decade ago with the issuance of the Letters of Rosa Luxemburg by Verso Books, and that was followed by effort to put together, as well as we can, the complete writings of Luxemburg, which means everything that she wrote, whether it's drafts, manuscripts, published works, and including, of course, material that has come to light, not just since her death in 1919, of course, but more recently, writings that have come to light. And as a matter of fact, just a few months ago, her very first writing in Polish was just discovered that we didn't even know about. So there's a lot of Rosa Luxemburg to discover, and the complete works is an effort to make all of it available in English. Today we'll be discussing, of course, as Lauren mentioned, Volume 4, which is the second of 3 parts of the collection dealing with her writings directly on revolution. What we decided to do was to divide the complete works into 3 basic divisions. One is her economic writings, which consists of volumes 1 and 2, her accumulation of capital, her anti-critique, etc., and many manuscripts on the non-Western world developed in the period between 1907 and 1914, and then followed by political writings, and then ultimately her complete correspondence. And the political writings are divided into several different rubrics. The first being her writings on revolution, which comprise 3 volumes, which volume 4 is the second volume. Volume 5, which carries up her writings on revolution through to 1910 through 1919 to her death. That's been submitted to Verso on New Year's Day this year, so we're looking forward to that being published, hopefully by the end of the year. And then we will have a new rubric that we're working on, her writings on revolutionary strategy and organization, that will comprise at least 3, perhaps 4 volumes, followed by other volumes devoted to such themes as colonialism and imperialism, writings on those subjects, and the national question. and a volume on her writings on culture, which is a lot that Rosa Luxemburg actually has to say to that issue as well. So it's very great to have the panelists here to have this discussion today. How we're going to go is in reverse order of alphabetical order. We'll start with Laurie Turner, who's a member of the editorial board of the Luxemburg Complete Works and has done great work in helping to put forward a lot of the work that we've been doing over the last number of years. We'll have David McNally, who's author of a lot of things, but especially Blood and Money, War, Slavery, Finance, and Empire, and has a lot of things to say about Rosa Luxemburg. Isabel Loureiro from Brazil, we're very, very proud to have her here, who has written a very important book in Portuguese on Rosa Luxemburg and has done a great deal to maintain the legacy of Rosa Luxemburg's ideas in Brazil. So she's joining us today from Brazil. And Eric Blanc, who has published not long ago, a very, very impressive book, which I encourage people to get into read, Revolutionary Social Democracy, and has written also extensively on Luxemburg and other figures within the Polish and Russian revolutionary movement of her period. So each speaker will get a chance to speak for 15 minutes, roughly, and then we'll have a lot of time for discussion back and forth and from all of you. So we'll get started then with Laurie.
Thank you. To begin, I'd like to thank everyone here. I'd like to thank my fellow board members of the Complete Works of Rosa Luxemburg. Thanks to Verso Books and thanks to the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung for the opportunity to share some thoughts on the occasion of the launch of Volume 4 on Revolution. Today marks the anniversary of the murder of Rosa Luxemburg at the hands of proto-fascist counter-revolutionaries during the course of the German Revolution. No one remembers their names. Since 1987, in Berlin, there's been a simple memorial spelling out the name Rosa Luxemburg in capital letters that stretches along the Landwehr Canal from the Liechtenstein Bridge, which now also bears her name. This is the site where Luxemburg's body was thrown into the canal. The memorial today, even more than on other days, will be laden with flowers, red flowers, carnations and roses especially. In his unconventional biography called Berlin Childhood, Walter Benjamin twice recalls this place. Whether he was thinking of Rosa Luxemburg in particular or unconsciously, the notoriety of this place would have been known to him. He sketches a picture of the bridge and the canal as a place to stop and remember. For the flaneur, the site is evocative, as if all that lies in store for us, he writes, has become the past. And further, he recalls, in those days, the shoreline of adult life appeared, just as cut off from my own existence as that bank on the canal on which the flower bed lay. Later, I would sometimes pass quite close by to the flower bed by the Landwehr Canal, but now it seemed to bloom less often. Benjamin's pensive words and the site today invite us to contemplate the traumatic past, which still has a hold on us, still exerts an unsettling tension between the past and the present. This is a point that was addressed in a recent work on memory and melancholia by Enzo Traverso. He writes, "The history of socialism is a constellation of defeats that nourished it for almost 2 centuries. Instead of destroying its ideas and aspirations, these traumatic, tragic, often bloody defeats consolidated and legitimated them. Falling after a well-fought struggle gives dignity to the vanquished and can become a source of pride." We do well to bear these words in mind as we review Luxemburg's legacy, for it's Rosa Luxemburg the revolutionary who we celebrate today with the launch of Volume 4 of her collected works in English. And it's the content of Volume 4, devoted as it is to lessons learned through the successes and failures of the 1905 revolution, which is so profoundly echoed in Traverso's words. A quick glance at the table of contents shows that the subject of Volume 4 is the aftermath of the 1905 revolution in Russia, as Rosa Luxemburg saw it. The vast quantity of newly translated and recently discovered primary source material included in this volume will prove to be invaluable to activists and scholars alike. Because it's organized chronologically within themes, the 3 volumes on revolution are presented in order by date, It's easier to trace the development of an idea or a concept. As anyone who has tried to work with Rosa Luxemburg's texts in the past will surely attest, this is a huge improvement over the disorderly, even if well-meaning, selection of articles in various anthologies, which tend to encourage reading out of context, in a vacuum, as it were. As well, Luxemburg's work is made much more accessible through the extensive and well-researched footnotes in these volumes. Verso and the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung must be commended for allowing this. The most well-known text in Volume 4, appearing here in a new translation, is entitled The Mass Strike, the Political Party, and the Trade Unions. It was written in 1906 in Finland in the company of Lenin and others who had themselves experienced the revolution firsthand. Luxemburg was recuperating from her 4-month ordeal in the brutal Warsaw Citadel, having been imprisoned there because of her activities in what was then Russian Poland. It could be argued that Luxemburg continues to fascinate us today precisely because of her unmediated account of and reflections on the events of a real revolution. This goes for both 1905 in Poland as well as 1918 in Germany. She commands the authority of a witness who leaves behind for posterity postcards from the revolution. In discussing mass action, Luxemburg captures images of the revolution in snapshots, where time stands still in the intersection of subjective and objective conditions. Curiously, she often draws comparisons to natural phenomena, what today we might call active weather. She uses terms like lightning bolt, lightning flash, ball lightning, zigzag lightning, electric shock, storm, hurricane, spark, wildfire, explosion, violent eruption, etc. Lightning is a recurring trope in the mass strike, leitmotif running throughout the 3 volumes on revolution, volumes 3, 4, and 5. A most powerful example may be found in her description of the mass strike triggered by the Bloody Sunday massacre in St. Petersburg. And here I just want to share a screen because this is a rather lengthy quote. I'll just pop that up there, hopefully. There. Hopefully people can see it. The sudden general insurrection of the proletariat in January under the tremendous impotence of the Petersburg events was outwardly a political act. Yet inwardly, this first universal direct class action had a retroactive effect that was all the more powerful in that in millions upon millions of people, it aroused class sentiment and class consciousness. For the first time, as if through an electric shock, and this awakening of class sentiment immediately expressed itself in the fact that all of a sudden, the masses of proletarians who numbered millions became acutely conscious of the intolerability of the social and economic existence that they had endured for decades under the bondage of capitalism. There thus began a spontaneous, generalized shaking off of and straining against these fetters. All the thousand-fold sufferings of the modern proletariat reminded of old bloody wounds, backward and degraded, having been aroused by the lightning flash in January, suddenly began to focus on their rights and attempted feverishly to make up for all omissions of the past. Such a snapshot of that historical moment as a confluence of memory, anger, and awakening is not the product of a feverish mind. Luxemburg is reporting on conditions. The immediacy of her words link us to that past in a way that only such poetic tropes may. Lightning both illuminates, as in a freeze frame, as well as symbolizes a trigger for action. The lightning trope conveys something of the speed with which recognition of danger and memory or awakening combine within a historical moment of potential restitution, a making up for all omissions of the past. Strikingly similar images appear in reports from other revolutions. Years later, a newspaper correspondent reported on a significant moment in the German Revolution as it appeared in Saxony in 1923. He wrote, "The immensity of the danger may at any moment provoke the spontaneous outbreak of a great revolutionary battle. It is not only weapons that decide between victory and defeat, it's the state of mind of the combatants. In every region of Germany, it feels itself stifled by the agonizing heaviness of the atmosphere which precedes the storm. The purifying lightning, the lightning which sparks the conflagration, may strike at any moment. This is quoted in Fourier. What they didn't know at the time was that this would be the final failure in the German Revolution. The general strike was called off, and the party leaders retreated back to Berlin. Such evocative images of mass strikes also offers us a glimpse of spontaneous proletarian action, a term that is quite contentious in the Luxemburg reception. It need not be. It must, however, be read as a key to Luxemburg's theory of the mass strike, what she learned and the lessons she meant to convey to her contemporaries. No review of this text would be complete without at least the bare minimum account. As the term suggests, spontaneous actions are unpredictable. That does not make them unsolicited. There is no doubt, as Luxemburg shows in the mass strike text, spontaneous interventions are specific to the demands of a particular historical moment. The examples she provides from 1905-1906 underline this. For instance, she differentiates a wide range of mass strikes from all kinds of planned demonstrations when she writes, and here I quote, "As such, they mostly occurred spontaneously, and in all cases their causes were specific, local, and incidental. They arose without a deliberate plan and grew with elemental power into great movements. These movements did not subsequently engage in an orderly retreat. Instead, they either transformed themselves into economic struggle or into street battles, or they collapsed of themselves." In this passage, she is not necessarily privileging any one type of strike over another. The emphasis here is on the role of spontaneity and how that may play at the beginning of a movement, which in the end might endure for some time. As opposed to what vulgar Marxists might think, Luxemburg does not separate spontaneity from consciousness. It's not a self-sufficient force. There is an epistemological dimension in her analysis. Clearly, consciousness generally develops through struggle. This does not preclude spontaneous struggle. Most importantly, it characterizes the proletariat as the repository of historical knowledge, what we just referred to as a making up for all omissions of the past. And here Luxemburg's biographer J.P. Nettle is correct when he characterizes her view of the masses as the repository of a final authority. For instance, there are scores of historical cases where workers catch their leaders off guard. In the mass strike text, Luxemburg references the mutiny on the battleship Potemkin. One might also want to recall the mutiny in Kiel, which triggered the German Revolution in 1918. Hugo Haase, leader of the USPD, the Independent Social Democratic Party, wrote to his wife the next day that this came as a complete surprise to him and to the party. Spontaneous mass actions prove that frequently the rank and file are much more militant and aware than their party and trade union leaders. And that should be a lesson. Spontaneity has practical and organizational significance. Her attempt to instruct her fellow Democrats on the importance of the mass strike was not entirely unlike her calling them to account in her earlier reform or revolution pamphlet. Retaining the same passionate tone of that earlier critique, she takes up both theoretical and organizational issues in the face of real mass struggles. As Peter Houdis and Sandra Ryan so succinctly put it in the introduction to Volume 4, Luxemburg's otherwise authoritative biographer J.P. Nettle got it wrong when he claimed Luxemburg made no original contributions to the tactics or methods of revolution. On the contrary, as eminent Luxembourg scholar Norman Gérard tells us, and I'm quoting him, in speaking about the genesis and unfolding of a period of revolutionary mass struggles, she placed due weight upon factors which are, from the point of view of revolutionary organization, spontaneous or objective. If she had not done that, she would not have been a Marxist. End quote. The mass strike text shows us that political strategy and the spontaneous creative energy of proletarian self-action may coexist. They are, as she says elsewhere, only different aspects of the same process. While acknowledging the difficulties for leaders, she warns, initiative and leadership consist not in commanding out of sheer volition, but in adapting as skillfully as possible to the situation and developing the keenest sense for the disposition of the masses. She's quite clear on this, and it ill behooves any revolutionary leader who would ignore the signals emanating from below. Images of revolution as a lightning bolt and mass strikes as containing moments of spontaneity suggest a final point I'd like to raise by way of a conclusion. The lightning bolt is a messianic, almost apocalyptic trope, while the other is a sophisticated theoretical concept. Together, they adapt to a severe and obviously unwelcome challenge to orthodox social democratic gradualism. For Luxemburg, the revolution of 1905 required a rethinking of assumptions about what motivates revolution. From this, we may see that her reflections present a radical disjunctive historiography, something which may also come under the rubric of lessons learned. In the mass strike, once again, Luxemburg wades into that highly charged space between party or trade union bureaucrats who would view the revolution as inevitable and those who would otherwise attempt to bring the revolution into being regardless of social conditions. Those Marx referred to as alchemists of the revolution. Teleology plays no part here. Mass strikes in all their forms do. As Luxemburg herself witnessed, one can no more sit and wait for the revolution to happen than attempt to bring it about artificially. Luxemburg dispels such illusions by showing that mass actions break the continuity of the apparent natural or progressive flow of capitalist exploitation. She makes this very clear in the mass strike essay when she writes, and here I quote, "The latter does not proceed in a neat, straight line, but rather in a sharply zigzagging, lightning-like trajectory. History causes explosions in the foremost, most exposed points as soon as the relations here are ripe for this, and then, in the turbulence of the revolutionary period, leeway is made up within a matter of days or months, disparities are compensated for, and in one jolt, social progress as a whole shifts into double quick step. The future is open-ended, as it must appear to a historical materialist. In the 1905 revolution, Luxemburg realistically sees no guarantees in the multitude of strikes, concessions, gains, losses, advances, and retreat in that struggle against absolutism and what she called barbaric forms of capitalist exploitation. Such struggles, as she writes, amount to an enormous work of civilization. However, in 1905, the extreme direction the contradictions of capitalist exploitation would take was as yet still inconceivable. When she refers again to spontaneous mass strikes 10 years later in the Junius pamphlet, her anti-evolutionism is much more starkly expressed as a choice between socialism or barbarism. While socialism may be the necessary and desirable historical outcome, only the collapse of capitalism, due to its contradictions, is inevitable. What form that collapse may take is not predictable. By 1915, we have a more sharply drawn expression of her anti-progressivist historiography. Volume 4 and its companion volumes 3 and 5 on revolution are filled with accounts of actual historical potential breaking through the continuity of exploitation. Snapshot images of those moments when anything might yet be possible echo down through the years. We know that the gains achieved were but temporary. The revolutions Luxemburg was directly involved in ultimately failed. However, the intentions should not, for that very reason, be forgotten. Thank you.
Peter, you're muted.
Sorry for not unmuting myself. Thank you very much, Lori, and we'll be hearing from all of our speakers, and then we'll take discussion after the four have spoken. So next is David McNally.
Wonderful. Thank you, Peter. Thanks, of course, to the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation and Lauren Balhorn in particular. Thanks to Verso Books and also to all my co-panelists. Thank you to Lori for those eloquent opening comments. I will try to focus my remarks on the question of revolution, obviously in relationship, as Lori did, to the question of the mass strike, which is really at the center of this wonderful volume. And huge thanks to Peter Hudis and Sandra Rain for all the editorial work they did and for the really illuminating introduction that they contributed to the volume. But I'm going to begin in a place that may surprise listeners and my co-panelists. I'm actually going to start with some remarks that come at the very end of the volume in Luxemburg's excerpts and notes on the English Revolution. And I want to suggest that she's thinking a lot in these notes about the inner dynamics of revolutionary struggle and transformation. And in particular, I think she's very acutely aware that classes, social classes, are not homogeneous blocks, that classes are complexly differentiated, that they consist of different currents, some much more socially conservative, other elements of a given social class, much more dynamic in character. And she's tracing all of these dynamics inside the English Revolution of the 1640s as she looks at the old order, the Ancien Régime, the New Model Army, Cromwell and the Presbyterians, the Leveller movement in London, and so on. And then she makes this remarkable but pithy little comment to herself in the notes with respect to German and European social democracy. And it's sardonic in character, so I'm going to emphasize for you a little bit of the irony. I'm just going to read you the two key sentences. Apparently, she writes, there can be no parties in social democracy anymore. By parties, she means political currents or tendencies. Apparently, there can be no parties in social democracy anymore because it represents only one class. That's only true for ideology, she writes. The theory is homogeneous, but reality has stratification and phases in historical development in which our side goes from an organizational member of civil society to its antipode. So classes are internally stratified, and the working class movement has an internal tension built into it between its struggle to be a member of civil society, bourgeois society, and its opposite, its gravedigger, as Marx and Engels put it. And this tension is going to be at the heart of all working class movements, even in revolutionary situations. That is to say, there will be elements that want to cling to its membership in the existing order of things, and there will be other elements driven, impelled, and reaching towards being its antipode, its opposite, or its gravedigger. And so there is this enormously nuanced sense in this passage of, as I say, the differentiated and complex organization of working class movements. And this includes social democracy itself. Social democracy is not homogeneous, and it contains elements that are adapting to the existing state of affairs and those that are pressing against it and to transform it. And she talks about this in a variety of ways. And in particular, I want to suggest that Luxemburg is really breaking throughout all this volume between what we might call the idea of the working class as having a static being towards a notion of the working class as a becoming, a subject or agent constantly in historical transformation and development. And this status of its becoming from one state member to another, antipode, is, of course, as I say, complex, and means that, as in the English Revolution, which she's studying in these passages, so in the Workers' Revolution, there will need to be immense internal struggles within the left, within the working class movement. And another way of thinking about what Luxemburg is doing here, as she emphasizes the becoming of the working class, is that in contrast to what I believe was the dominant tendency inside German social democracy, she's counterposing a qualitative to a quantitative notion of the growth of the movement. The dominant tendency inside German social democracy at the time was to imagine that quantitative growth was the key to everything. More union members, more party members, more votes in elections to the Reichstag and other levels of government. But Luxemburg, in one formulation after another, is emphasizing the qualitative growth of the proletariat, or what she refers to as its intellectual and cultural growth in the writings on the mass strike. That is to say, the growth in socialist solidarity and in intransigent opposition to the system. Here, of course, she's picking up on a key motif in Marx. When Marx writes in the manuscripts that we know as the German ideology, that the working class is not fit to rule in its current state, it must make itself fit to rule. And in order to make itself fit to rule, it needs to shed the muck of ages, as he says, as Marx writes, and that it can do so only through struggle. That it's through mass struggle that the working class not only changes the world around it, its external environment, the working class transforms itself by creating new socialist solidarities and sensibilities. And this is where I return to her treatment of the mass strikes of 1905. Drawing on that experience, as Laurie says, this is a hands-on experience. This is someone who was in the thick of organizing within the mass strikes in Russian occupied and controlled Poland. Luxemburg says to us, and she is the first major Marxist thinker to say this, that the principal modality of the self-organization and self-education of the working class for revolution is the mass strike itself. Yet, as Peter and Sandra point out very, very clearly in their introduction, this is no mere syndicalism. This is not the notion that trade union organization is adequate to the task. There's a clear delineation of the leadership role of socialist parties in all of these detailed and nuanced writings. But there's also a very, very clear commitment to the idea of a fighting party that prioritizes mass struggle and self-organization over the struggles that take place much of the time to become a weightier member of civil society. That is to say, to build unions, increase the size of party branches, and so on. This is why electoral and parliamentary politics are, for Luxemburg in all of these writings, a means to a different end. Absolutely, she is for participation in the electoral and parliamentary sphere, but this is only a preparatory phase of organization and strengthening for the mass struggles to come, in which the mass strike is the center. The mass strike, as she puts it, is the form of the revolutionary struggle. And this notion that there is, in fact, now, after 1905, a discernible form of revolutionary working class struggle, I think is often not adequately understood. The depth of the insight is not adequately understood within wide sections of the left. She refers to the mass strike, for instance, as the method of motion of the proletarian mass. Method of motion. Now notice, I said earlier that Luxemburg is emphasizing processes of becoming, of self-development and self-transformation. And she reminds us of the diversity of this motion. The motion of the working class is not linear. It's full of internal contradictions, and to use Laurie's beautiful description, of lightning bolts. This is not a simple linear process. It's full of great leaps and developmental moments. Moreover, as Peter and Sandra tell us in their introduction, Luxemburg delineates about 15 different kinds of strikes, in fact, that are all elements of the mass strike, all constitutive of the mass strike. As a result, there's no simple shift either from economic strikes to political strikes. In fact, sometimes it is the political strike over a political cause that induces a wave of economic organizing among previously disorganized or unorganized sectors of the working class. And so again, to quote briefly, cause and effect here continually change places. Their unity is precisely the mass strike. So the mass strike is a wellspring of a diverse form of struggle, drawing ever wider layers of the working class and the oppressed into motion. But vitally important, Luxemburg also says to us here that struggle produces organization. And I want to emphasize this: struggle produces organization. This is where the charge of spontaneism so often misses the mark. After all, whatever spontaneous elements, quote unquote, may exist here, organization is being created. And organization, of course, raises conscious intervention by working class and socialist elements into the struggle. And here she counterposes her position to what she calls, quote, the rigid, bureaucratic, mechanical conception, unquote. The latter imagines that endless amounts of organization are necessary before the proletariat might dare engage in mass struggle. But Luxemburg reverses the relationship and says that in mere days and weeks of insurgent mass struggle, the proletariat can create the most far-ranging, deep organizational forms, so that struggle drives organization to new levels. This is what she calls, in contrast to the rigid, bureaucratic, mechanical approach, quote, the living dialectical approach. The living dialectical approach understands that self-activity of the working class is the key to deep mass organization. And this takes me to a few remarks on the question of revolution itself. There have been, I think, a number of misguided criticisms of those of us who quaintly still hold to the idea of revolution on the socialist left. And I think very often they don't really engage with what the actual views of someone like Rosa Luxemburg are. And I want to just spend a couple of moments on what she says here. She counterposes the image of working class revolution that she's developing in these texts to what she describes as the police interpretation. The police interpretation focuses on riots and street battles. And Luxemburg makes clear she has nothing against riots and street battles, but she argues these accompany the mass strike. But the heart of the revolution, in her view, is the mass strike itself. Similarly, she says, very often the revolution today is equated with barricades. But she reminds us, as many Marxist writers did at the time, this is really the image we inherit from 1848. Again, she says, battles on barricades may accompany the mass strike, but they're not its heart. They might appear as what she calls a moment in a larger arc of revolutionary mass upheaval. What a revolutionary movement of the working class does, she tells us, is to create new forms of motion, of self-organization and counter-power. And to do this, to constitute a revolutionary movement, the mass strike must acquire two essential features, she says. First, it must become, quote, a real people's movement. And by a real people's movement, she means, first, it has to go beyond the organized working class. It has to draw in the most pauperized, marginalized, and least organized layers, who will often rise to heights of activity that no one would have expected based on their prior histories of organizing. And it must draw in other oppressed social layers, poor farmers, workers in the so-called informal sector, and so on. So the mass strike becomes a real people's movement. Secondly, it must transform relations of power within society. And she refers to this as constituting a breakthrough, which is, quote, above all, a thoroughgoing internal reversal of class relations. An internal reversal means that power is being seized from below, in workplaces, in communities, in the streets, in the constitution of new centers of working class and popular power, which of course were the Soviets that first emerged, the great workers' councils of 1905. Now, I want to suggest in the last minute or two that I have the ways in which this legacy from Luxemburg remains indispensable today. And I think one way of really highlighting this is to point out that in the period that we have seen over the last 15 years or so, the mass strike has returned globally. The mass strike has reappeared, not yet the revolutionary mass strike, much more the preparatory mass strike, the mass strike that has the capacity to foster new forms of social organization. So think, for instance, of the farmers' protests in India in 2020 and 21, and the general strikes of 250 million workers in solidarity with them. Think of the general strikes in Chile in 2019, when a youth and student-led rebellion against transit hikes led to a wave of months and months of general strikes, beginning with coal miners, but then sweeping through other sections of the economy. Think of the wave of teacher strikes from the Oaxaca commune of 2006, where the teachers of Oaxaca led one of the most militant strike waves of this century, all the way through the Red for Ed teacher strikes in the United States, the Chicago teacher strikes of 2012 and 19, Los Angeles teacher strikes, and of course, the teacher strikes in Puerto Rico in 2019. And think finally of the refashioning and reclaiming of the strike by feminists, climate justice organizers, and students. The global climate strikes, the international women's strikes, the student strikes in places like Quebec and Chile, which drew in thousands upon thousands of organized workers into mass campaigns. Now, I don't want to suggest for a moment that our situation today is identical to Luxemburg's. We need to do a huge amount of work in the same spirit that she did with respect to the mass strikes of 1905 in relationship to the mass insurgencies that we see around us today. The changed forms of global capitalism, the ways in which the working class globally has been decomposed and recomposed, all require real work on our part to be equal to the kind of analysis that she provided. But she has left us a remarkable and rich legacy, and one that the radical left today organizes, would I suggest, ignore at its peril. The resources here are immensely rich, and we are in huge debt to the editors and publishers of the complete works for everything they're doing in this regard. And of course, we are forever in the debt of Rosa Luxemburg herself, who, as Clara Zetkin wrote, gave herself completely to the cause of socialism, and as Zetkin said, represented, quote, the sharp sword, the living flame of revolution. Thank you.
Thank you, David, very much. Okay, Isabel, the next speaker from Brazil.
Okay. Thank you to you, Peter, and Verso and Rosa Luxemburg Foundation for the invitation. It's really a great joy for me to participate with you all in this discussion today. To begin, I want to do two general comments about this fantastic endeavor, the publication of the complete works of Rosa Luxemburg in English. And afterward, I would like to make a few comments on Luxemburg ideas that appear in this volume 4 to introduce our discussion. And if I compare my modest initiative here in Brazil, I published 2 volumes of political writings and 1 volume of letters. I'm very, very impressed because I know what a project of this magnitude represents in terms of work. And my first general comment, I like this very much, is your thematic organization of the writings instead of a chronological one. I like very much the way that you did. I think it's easier for one to orient oneself in reading the texts. And secondly, I think you are right in starting the volumes of political writings with the theme on revolution. And I agree, totally agree with the interpretation that this is, I quote, the red thread that defines her originality and contemporary relevance as a theoretician. This is from the introduction in volume 3. I think that a good epigraph for Luxemburg's work is the well-known phrase, and I quote in German because I like very much, Die Revolution ist großartig, alles andere ist Quark. We can translate the revolution is great, everything else is rubbish, as she writes from Warsaw in a letter to Emanuel and Mathilde Wurm after being released from prison. And now I would talk a little bit about our shared passion, Comrade Luxemburg. My first observation is about the writer, Rosa Luxemburg. Her articles here in the volume 3 and 4, but volume 4, on the first Russian Revolution, vividly show her talent as a journalist and as a polemist. She is, above all, well-informed. She writes in a vibrant and didactic style, harshly criticizes the Polish press and the Polish and harshly criticized the Polish bourgeois press and parties, but also, this is very important, the left-wing parties like the Socialist, the Polish Socialist Party and the Socialist Revolutionary Party, the SR, no? That advocate terrorism and the arming of workers to face Tsarism. She doesn't economize on irony regarding the comedy of a parliament, a Duma, with a minority of progressive deputies and ardently defends the mass strike as the workers' new method of struggle. And finally, when after the defeat of the revolution, she exposes the raw violence of the ongoing counter-revolution, she doesn't lose hope of a new workers' uprising in the future. And she was right. In short, she shows the unfolding of events in detail and thus allows the readers to form their own opinion. What we can see in action is the thinker, and I quote, who placed so much emphasis on enlightenment and self-awareness, as you say at the end of your introduction. The Russian Revolution of 1905-1907, the first revolution in which she participated as a leader, a propagandist, a theorist, writing articles for the Polish and German socialist press, had in fact, as we know, a great impact throughout Luxembourg's political life. The Polish articles, mostly written for Czerwony Standard, the red flag, no? SDKPIL's main newspaper at that time, form an impressive chronicle of revolutionary events, allowing us to reconstruct in detail how she understood the revolution. The reader clearly realizes that the text, the mass strike, the political parties, and the trade unions, published at the end of September 1906, one of her best known and most influential writings, did not fall from the sky. This brilliant summary of the storm that hit the Russian Empire from top to bottom results from an intense earlier work, whose results are expressed here in these volumes of the complete works, the third and the fourth volume. Now, I would like to comment quickly some ideas that appear in these articles and, in my opinion, are still current. The first one is her great insight is that the formation of class consciousness takes place in action more than in reading theoretical works or pamphlets, although theoretical education is also very important for her. A second idea is, as a careful observer of what was going on in Russia, Luxemburg emphasizes the role of mass spontaneity, which of course does not mean that she plays down the role of organization. This was the caricature that Stalinism made of Luxemburg's work better to combat her ideas within communist circles. In opposition to this arbitrary simplification, I think that a striking feature in these texts is the dialectic between organization and spontaneity, and between economics and politics. And this happens because Rosa Luxemburg had a great sensibility to capture reality in motion. And now I would like to make a quick comment on the spontaneity in Luxemburg, an idea that causes so much controversy concerning her legacy. As we know, each epoch reads Luxemburg from the problems of the present. And this is the case of the French anarchist historian Daniel Guérin in his book of 1971, Rosa Luxemburg et la spontanéité révolutionnaire, still under the influence of the May 68 rebellion. He argues that Luxemburg, in the text, the mass strike, the political parties, and the trade unions, is close to anarchism. For him, if Luxemburg tries to distinguish the concept of mass strike from that of general strike of the anarchists, it's precisely because being theoretically steeped in Marxism and politically linked to social democracy, she felt obliged to repress her libertarian sensibility, between quotes. I would like to add that, moreover, when she tries to distinguish the concept of mass strike from that of general strike, she does so, I think, in an unconvincing way. For Guérin, Luxemburg's relevance lies in the emphasis she gives to the self-organization of the masses, to workers' councils, in short, to everything that comes from below. And for him, the limits of Rosa Luxemburg lay in the fact that she never managed to free herself completely from a conception of centralization and organization from above that she had absorbed in the years of militancy in German social democracy. And we can add, he don't say that, but we can add in the SDKPIL. No? I wonder whether Guérin had known the Polish articles now published, his impression would have been reinforced. As you write in the introduction to volume 4, and I quote, the image of Luxemburg as an inclusive figure who opposed centralism and hierarchical forms of organization, while not without merit, paints a stereotypical picture that is often inconsistent with her work in the Polish movement, end quote. Therefore, I think, I don't know if you agree, your interpretation is in line with Guérin's. And I think that nowadays, after the Occupy movements, whose emphasis on horizontality and spontaneity showed their limits, the role of the organization has regained relevance in left-wing circles. I would like to know if the role played by the movement Occupy Wall Street was important in your interpretation. When I was reading your introduction, I was wondering if, when pointing out the role of organization and even of centralism in Luxemburg's work, you had the Occupy movement as a problematic counterpoint. Am I right, or is it pure nonsense? I'm curious to know. A third idea is, as we know, Luxembourg defends democratic freedoms, freedom of discussion, assembly, and press, necessary for the political formation of workers, both in bourgeois society and in the transition to socialism, and in a likely future socialist society. For her, freedom to criticize is needed everywhere, including left-wing parties, as we can see in the article Critique in the Workers' Movement in the 4th volume. Luxemburg was a daughter of the Aufklärung, the Enlightenment, which is unfortunately lacking in a world where fake news dominates. Against the PPS, the Polish Socialist Party, which forbids debate within its ranks, she writes, I quote, they, the workers, were supposed to believe what the PPS said, just as devout Catholics are supposed to believe what the church teaches, end quote. She would have said the same for the Stalinized communist parties. And a fourth idea is, having the 1905 revolution as a model, Luxemburg understands that to overthrow Tsarism it's necessary to win the hearts and minds of the great popular masses of the empire, instead of forming terrorist groups or armed militias without the support of the masses. In this sense, a revolution in Luxemburg's understanding is a profound economic, political, social, and cultural change, entirely democratic, in which the popular masses, aware of their interests, are engaged, including rural workers and small peasants. A revolution worthy of the name cannot be the result of a coup by a party committee formed by conspirators. And finally, she is against the idea of a single workers' party, which would be the true and only representative of the class. She writes, I quote Rosa Luxemburg, "A truly working class party may consider itself and has the right to consider itself a representative of the interests of working people and as their champion in the revolutionary fight. In the course of its activities, it cannot ever consider itself to be identical to the people or to the revolutionary, unless it wants to make of revolutionary government a revolutionary, between commas, farce." This is from Organization Disorganization. Just as with regard to freedom of criticism, here too we can see a rejection of what later became known as Stalinism. This is just an extremely brief summary of a rich constellation of ideas that shows Luxemburg's originality and as a forerunner of the critique of left-wing authoritarianism in the 20th century. In that sense, I agree with you that Netto's verdict needs to be questioned. As you remind us in your introduction, according to Netto, Lenin drew lessons on the role of the revolutionary peasantry. Trotsky elaborated the doctrine of permanent revolution, while Luxemburg would not have left any, I quote, original contributions to the tactics or methods of revolution, end quote. This is an unfair and partial portrayal of the deep reflection made by her about the revolution of 1905. Netto is a great biographer, no doubt, but he has misjudged Luxemburg more than once. I can't help mentioning that he entitles the chapter of his biography on Luxemburg, which covers the period from 1906 to 1909, the lost years, precisely those years in which she elaborated her fundamental work on political economy. Raya Dostoevskaya is right, and she is furious with Netto because he, with a clear masculine attitude, considers that the love break with Leo Jogiches in 1907 had ended Luxemburg's life. To conclude, and agreeing with Felix Tisch, the great Polish historian and one of the best Luxemburg's commentators, we see that there is a continuity between the defense of the autonomous action of the masses and the defense of the democratic freedoms in 1905, and the famous text written in prison in 1918, in which Luxemburg criticizes the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly by the Bolsheviks. Not by chance, this writing was considered heretical in the USSR. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Isabel. Very enlightening. Okay, so Eric Blanc now is up, and once Eric is done, then we will jump into discussion. I'll start the discussion just by making a couple of quick announcements. But Eric?
Great, thanks to my co-panelists, thanks to the hosts, thanks to all of you out there. I'm gonna try to hew to the spirit, if not the letter, of Luxemburg. And at her best, I think she really focused on and was able to overcome some of the kind of unfounded axioms and myths that had kind of accumulated in the Marxist movement, the socialist movement, and was able to help the movement question these. And it's in that spirit that I offer these comments. So what I want to do is look, like my co-panelists, at the mass strike, which is really, I think, at the center of this volume, and think through, how it was rooted in the context of Tsarist Russia, and why that might mean, and why I do think it means, that the relevance of provision of revolution specifically is not particularly relevant for pretty dramatically different political contexts where political freedom and parliamentary rule, parliament, or at least democratic parliaments, exist. So as she writes in this volume, it is manifestly completely misguided to regard the Russian Revolution as something specifically Russian. And so what's original about Luxemburg, and some of my co-panelists mentioned this, but I just want to maybe build off of that, is this idea really of action preceding organization and consciousness, and action not without leadership driving this forward, not just in general, but particularly also in revolutionary processes. And what I do in my book is show that actually this conception of struggle was really common across Imperial Russia. My book's on the non-Russian Marxists, and it's not something that Luxemburg actually invented, and it was pretty widespread, particularly since the 1903 general strike wave in the borderlands of the Russian Empire. There was all sorts of people who were saying, yeah, it's action that is driving things forward, from the Jewish Bund to her comrades in the SDKPL in Poland to the early Mensheviks. So her conception of the revolution in Russia as being driven forward by action, and that driving forward organization and consciousness, culminating in revolution, I think is entirely right for Russia. And I think her her treatise on this is like descriptively correct. The question, and I think this is what we should dig into, is whether it follows, as she does, to take a leap, and this is her originality, of saying this type of revolutionary process is valid not just for Russia, where there's a brutal Tsarist autocracy, but essentially for the rest of the world. And she argues that, and that's the novelty of her mass strike pamphlet, like, pretty explicitly, not just for Germany, but more generally. And so the operating assumption here is a break with Second International Marxism that had conceived of a much greater weight to organization building, to consciousness raising, with the goal of combining this with action in eventually winning a majority of the population that would then get expressed in parliamentary attempt to win a socialist majority in parliament. And she breaks with this and says, well, actually, what's going to drive forward this process to getting a majority is the mass strike, essentially. Like, this is the crucial thing that we're missing elsewhere. The irony here is that Luxemburg is actually pioneering an argument that later gets picked up by Leninists, really by revolutionary Bolsheviks in the early Leninist and later Trotskyist tradition, of generalizing an experience from the Russian context and projecting it internationally. And it's ironic because, as Isabel and others mentioned, she never fully embraces this. So, like, in her famous 1918 critique of the Bolsheviks, she pulls back against their attempt to project the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly and some political freedoms as sort of a universally valid mode of revolution. And she pushes back against that, I think, correctly. But nevertheless, she employs a similar strategic extrapolation by saying, look, 1905, this shows what's going to happen, needs to happen in the rest of the world if we're ever going to get this majority and the revolutionary transformation that we need. And so I think the crucial question we need to ask ourselves, over 100 years later, is whether this vision of revolution has been borne out by events. It's compelling, and I used to think it was correct, and I think that it would be ideal if this were possible, and it would be ideal if the world over the last 100 years confirmed her hopes that this would be a form of struggle that could essentially be exported to capitalist democracies. But the balance sheet, I think, if you look rigorously, or even glance at the history of the last 100 years, is that the way political struggle and class struggle and the fight for socialism has developed in contexts that are non-autocratic. In other words, in contexts where you can build mass unions, mass parties, and in which there's a legitimate parliament, just class struggle develops differently. And workers have tended to be somewhat more moderate than she anticipated. And this isn't not actually specifically a critique of Luxemburg. I think in her overestimation of the revolutionary inclinations of like the Western working class, but really, workers and parliamentary democracies generally. This isn't specific to Luxemburg. It was shared by Kautsky, it was shared by Marx, it was shared by Lenin and Trotsky. And unfortunately for our movement, and this is the contradiction that we're all dealing with, the reality has been that it's not just that, I'll first address a critique. Why is it that revolutions then haven't happened? Well, according to Leninists, the major problem is that this has been blocked by, and the mass strike developing the revolution has been blocked by bureaucratic leaderships. And I think there's some truth to this. I think largely the critiques that Luxemburg puts forward in this volume and that other, revolutionary socialists have put forward since of the trade union and party officialdom are largely right. They often are a block. But what this fails to really grapple with is why a majority of workers continue to follow these moderate socialists, unlike in Russia, where they superseded them, in which radical socialists, really from the beginning of the movement, almost to the end, with very few blips in between, were the hegemonic current. And so the question is, well, what is the social basis, and what is the reason for the perseverance of relatively moderate views amongst so many workers, including in times of mass strikes and times in which revolutionaries would hope that things could have developed into revolution? Because the balance sheet has been that there's never been a majoritarian push like there was in Russia in a context of capitalist democracy, in which the mass strike dynamic has culminated in an actual revolution. And not just that, there hasn't even been a time where mass strikes led a majority of workers to break from reformism, right? But they continued. If you look at May 68, if you look at strikes similarly, since there was a minority of workers that came to revolutionary conclusions, but most continued to follow and take their lead from moderate socialists. And I don't think that's because they were tricked. I think it's because in contexts where you can build strong organizations and in which there is a relatively democratic state, the inclinations, for better or for worse, of most workers has been not to throw themselves just into one general strike after another, eventually culminating in some sort of uprising, which is the conception that Luxemburg and others sort of explicitly put forward. But the reality is people, when given the opportunity, will seize the openings that exist institutionally to try to make those work for socialist transformation. I'm not arguing, and I don't think we should conclude that workers haven't wanted socialism, but the forms that would take have been less based on mass action than she anticipated, for the reason just that unions and electoral openings pose different dilemmas. And so where we've seen the kind of mass strike culminating in revolutionary possibilities have been autocratic regimes, semi-autocratic regimes like Germany, so the German context in which she was operating was like hardly a capitalist democracy in any sort of meaningful sense. Political freedom was very restricted. Parliament was very restricted. And even there, workers on a whole weren't prepared to completely break from, parliamentary rule. So then this raises just the question of what does this mean for us as socialists? We can continue to hope that this vision of revolutionary, well, this time around will turn around. This time around it's going to be different. But I think we should just, I think we need to reassess based off of what the actual experience is. It's a real conflation of general strikes. I'll put it this way. I'll respond to what David mentioned, because I largely agree with his point that action can radically transform workers. And so I think we need more strikes. We need more general strikes. And these are great. Most of my work is in labor, and I've written about the 2018 teacher strikes. And so we need more of that. It'd be great. And we should push for more workers to get the experience and radicalization of action. But, it's just not the case that this is some sort of a precursor to revolution. The red state strikes in the US weren't a precursor and didn't indicate some sort of form of revolutionary struggle. They just have a more limited, dynamic, because then elections happen in West Virginia, for instance, and we can say it's bad, but it's just the case. There was the strike, and then people said, well, and we'll get them in November, vote them out in November. And so this always happens, and we can grapple with that, or we can continue to say, well, we need to convince workers that these other openings are really sort of a sham. And I think that the conclusion is that if it is the case that workers are going to seize not only mass action opportunities, which they do, but also electoral opportunities and sort of patient unionization buildings, then I think that the emphasis on mass action driving forward the revolutionary process just has to be tempered with a more actually open-ended and more kind of humble approach of us as socialists to say we need to find ways to combine strategically electoral politics, union building with disruptive action from below. And there's tensions there. There's very real tensions. I don't think, I'm certainly not arguing that we should throw all of our weight into the electoral realm. And I think that it's very clear, and you can point to a lot of examples in which movements have gotten excessively focused on just institutional politics. The sort of $64,000 question for us as socialists, and I think that if Rosa Luxemburg were around today, she would agree, is figuring out how to combine institutional politics, union and electoral, with this disruptive insurgent dynamic from below. And the experience then I think we need to look to is less of 1905 in Russia, which is pretty dramatically different context, and not just economically, but politically from so many countries of the world today, but to look at where workers' movements have gone furthest in places where you could have the legal right to build unions, and which you could have the potential to electing a left government to power. And in those type of contexts, it hasn't been revolutionary socialists armed with a Leninist or a Luxemburg type perspective that have come closest to winning a majoritarian politics, but it's been democratic socialists who have done more, I think, of what I've described of trying to combine bottom-up struggle with attempts to elect left parties to parliament. And that's really hard. We don't have an answer to that. And I think we should just acknowledge that there hasn't been yet a successful socialist revolution or anything approximating that in a capitalist democracy. So we should be wary of assuming that writings emanating from autocratic contexts are relevant for us still today. And I think that, as I indicated at the beginning, and I'll just leave it at this, is in line with the best spirit and the best kind of critical rigor of Luxemburg, who's able to break with these types of outdated dogmas on a lot of things. And just we have enough experience over the last 100 years to say that we need class struggle, we need mass action, we need socialism. But I think it's going to take a different form than the revolution in 1905. Okay, thank you.
And thank you, Eric. Thank you very much. And thank you to all of our panelists for opening up what I hope will now be a very rich back and forth and discussion with our audience. Just before we get started on that, I just want to let you know that Verso is offering the new volume 4 at a 20% discount. So jump in there if you want to get the book, and you get a 20% discount on it. It's only available right now in hardcover and in e-version, but it will be available, we hope, in paperback within probably about a year from now. That's usually how it works with Verso. I do want to also let you know that the paperback of volume 3, which is the first volume of the rubric on revolution that several of the panelists spoke of, that's already out in paperback, and that's also available from Verso, so at a much more affordable price than the hardback. And so the two volumes really go together. And when volume 5 is out, hopefully within a year from now, you'll be able to get them all together. We have quite a number of questions that have come in from the chat for the various panelists. So I will read out a couple of them. We'll take about 3 or 4 of the questions and then bring it back to the panelists rather than just answering one seriatim, as it were, to get a little bit more back and forth with our audience. But feel free to pose any questions or comments that you have. We have about another 40 minutes for discussion. So, and that for us is always the most important part of what we do. Okay, so I'll just read out the first question that came in was, Where are all these heretofore unknown materials by Luxemburg being found? Second question was, reading volume 3 of the complete works, which is the one I mentioned is now in paperback, I was struck by how much Luxemburg stresses the importance of 1905 revolution and the seeding in advance of social democratic revolutionary ideas. Does this theme return in volume 4? And third question is, but what about the struggle for reforms in a non-revolutionary period, such as now, which I think Eric was addressing? And then the fourth, I'll stop at the fourth, there'll be a lot to remember now, is David or others, could you discuss how the Black Lives Rebellion fostered creative organizing? To David's point about a real people's movement, does the actually existing Popular Front count as an example of that? So who would like to jump in from the panelists to go after any one or all of those four? I mean, I can jump in just to get us started on the first question. On the where are these materials that are being found located? Got to realize a good 80 to 85% of volume 4 has never been in English before. About 35%, maybe a little bit more than that of the volume, is writings of Luxemburg translated from the Polish. And there's not a lot of her Polish writings that were made available, not just in English, but even in German. The Gesammelte Werke had very little of her German collected works, contained very little of her Polish writings. So most of these have to be translated from the original documents, the revolutionary newspapers or theoretical journals that she wrote on in the period between the time that her revolutionary organization was founded in Poland in 1893 to about 1911 or so. She stops writing in Polish more or less after 1911 for various reasons. But the real answer to the question is the person who is the person we're all indebted to in this is Annelies Laschiska, who was the editor of the Gesammelte Werke, as well as the collected letters of Luxemburg in German. She spent 45 years of her life tracking down writings of Luxemburg that were not known of. And that's not an easy thing to do because a lot of her work was published anonymously or under pseudonyms. So then the question becomes, how do you find out? Like in volume 3, there's all these newspaper journalistic articles reporting day-by-day account of the Russian Revolution. They weren't published under her name. So how do you know which ones were by her and which ones by somebody else? Annelies Laschiska, who passed away, unfortunately, a few years ago, devoted her life to this sort of work. And there's been 2 volumes published under her auspices in German that collect, since 2016, much of these German writings, 2,000 pages worth that were not known or not available before 2016. Journalistic articles, manuscripts. This is also where the Notes on the English Revolution that David mentioned was discussed, came from. And but then there's also this massive Polish material, and that is still in the process of being sorted out. Isabel had mentioned and quoted from the essay she had written that's published in volume 4, Organization and Disorganization. Well, just about, I don't know, a couple of months ago, more than a couple of months ago, maybe about 5 or 6 months ago, Jörn Strumpf in Germany, who works with the RLS and has done magnificent work in collecting and trying to find some of Luxemburg's unknown or unpublished writings in this and carrying forward the work of Annelies, discovered in Polish a document that she wrote in response to a critics of that document called Once Again on Organization and Disorganization. We had already sent volume 4 to the press, so it couldn't appear in volume 4, but it is appearing as an appendix in volume 5. It was written the same year as Organization and Disorganization in 1906. And there's new things popping up all the time, which is what makes this project a little difficult. If you're going to have a complete works, you got to have everything. And so if you have a thematic arrangement with a volume covering a certain number of years, you want to make sure you get everything that she wrote in those various years. But we always seem to find something, or Jörn finds something, which has really done magnificent work for us in this, and others who are working in Polish, and Holger Polit as well, who published a short but very important volume, which Isabel is reminding us of, on Luxemburg's writings of 1905 to 1908 in Polish. And it's a very, very important source as well. So that's a question on that one. All right, jump in, the panelists who would like to take up any one of the other questions that were raised, or respond to each other's comments that you've already made. Certainly looking forward to back and forth. David?
Thanks, Peter. I'll just come back really on two themes, one of which is the question that was put about the significance of the BLM uprising for the left today. And I'll simply preface it at this point, not by way of kind of deep and sustained engagement with Eric's comments, which I think are appropriately provocative for all of us, except really to say that I think the challenge for everyone on the radical left, when we talk about balance sheets over the last 100 years, is to acknowledge that every meaningfully socialist current has no meaningful successes to point to. It's not simply the case that the revolutionary left has all of these failed models, but somehow the electoral left has a great wave of successes. The reality is that the socialist movement has precious few examples anywhere in the last century to which to point or upon which to build. And I know in my own case as a young person radicalizing, for the electoral moment of the election of the Popular Unity government in Chile seemed so rife with possibilities. And personally, I had tremendous conversations with people who rejected the revolutionary position, like Ralph Miliband, who were really honest about the ways in which the overthrow of Salvador Allende and the Popular Unity government raised huge questions that they had to be very honest about the challenges confronting the electoral or parliamentary road. So I just preface by saying that I think we need a spirit in which we don't pretend that any of us have fantastic successes to build on. We need then to enter into what do we build upon in terms of an analysis of the world today and histories of popular insurgency and struggle that offer any hope, any prospects, any vision for socialism. And there's no question I'm much more in the Luxemburg camp on those things, which takes me to Black Lives Matter, because I think we sometimes forget that the scale, not simply the scale of that insurgency, according to the New York Times, 26 million people who took to the streets in the United States alone in over 1,500 cities and towns, but the radicalization that was at its heart. I mean, we are talking about places with so little history of mass mobilizing, where, I mean, there are so-called sundown towns in Texas where hundreds and hundreds of people came out and where the racists, the right, had simply lost political momentum. 6 girls between 13 and 15 in Memphis who met online and organized a demo of 10,000 people. 60,000 people who came out here in Houston, where George Floyd was born and raised, which included people just walking out of workplaces to join the protests and so on. And we need to recognize that the moment of absolute fear in ruling class circles about the thing getting out of control was the athlete strikes of the summer of 2020. Obama wasn't only sent in to torpedo the Bernie Sanders campaign in 2020. He was also sent in to meet with LeBron James and others and stop the workplace walkouts by athletes. It was the idea that Black Lives Matter might also now snowball into a wave of strikes for Black Lives Matter, of essentially, going back to Luxemburg's categories, political demonstrative strikes, strikes over a critical political cause. It was Obama who sat with LeBron James and other athletes and said, hey, we'll use basketball arenas for voter registration if you guys will stop. So there, I think we see precisely the dilemma that we're grappling with in all of this. And for me, what we're seeing in one location after another right now as the technocratic reorganization of liberal democracy completely dilutes and guts it in terms of people feeling like it has hugely meaningful impacts on their lives. I think, in fact, we're seeing a return to the streets and to the strike. And I can mention, Chile, Colombia, India, and so on, in terms of the return of as I said earlier, non-revolutionary mass strikes. Eric's right. These mass strikes are not revolutionary or insurrectionary at this point. And I think that has to do with a whole historical process of rebuilding after the defeats of neoliberalism. But I'm convinced that the BLM insurgency was also pointing to the strike as a key modality of struggle and reorganization of an emergent left. And I'd really be happy to come back to that later and elaborate on that if that's helpful.
Okay. Do I see, Lori, is that a hand? I think you're muted still. Okay, jump in.
Brief comment to follow David's comments. I did like that comment that you had made about organizations, including non-traditional or non-organized workers, because that is, of course, a crucial thing that happened in the moment of the Weimar Republic with the unemployed and the role that they played in fascist politics. So I think that we do need to consider this. I don't know that it's an easy look back into the past, because so much has transpired between the time in which Luxemburg is writing and now. And Luxemburg is writing even before all the forces of fascism had fully formed. And then how, of course, fascism is reappearing in forms of neo-fascism, and these non-organized workers. I think Luxemburg is still relevant in the sense that the critique may be brought to bear on party structures and political structures, but the role of the working class, I think we do need to look at what you were saying. This is very nuanced and not homogenous at all. So I don't know if I just messed up your answer or if I just added to it. Or
Thank you. All right. Isabel, did you have anything what to say here?
I was thinking about what is going on in Brazil now. We have a fascist movement. Maybe this is too strong to say that a movement, but they are not organized workers. They are not workers. They are more middle class, like people. They work in the government and the province government and so on. People, they are retired, quite old people. These people, they are in Brasilia 2 weeks ago, and destroyed the buildings of the government. I think you know what I'm speaking about. And I think, when we speak about popular movements, these people are also popular. This is, we cannot say this is a movement, but they are not rich people. They are these people, they are informed by the social networks and so on. And this is really today a problem about all over the world, I think. But in Brazil, this is a very, very strong problem, and we are worried about it. I have no answer, but when I think the left-wing movements, we are happy when this happens, but we have also popular and political manifestations of the extreme right people, no? And we have to think about it.
Thank you. Eric?
Sure. Well, I appreciate all the comments. I'll be brief. I'll respond to David, and I agree with, I appreciate Isabella mentioned about Brazil, and to me, Brazil is also a really fascinating example of the tensions of trying to have a left governor and trying to combine that with struggle from below, and it's really hard. But I think that trying to more forthrightly grapple with those contradictions is the only way forward. And so in that regard, I want to just respond to what David said, which is like, well, there's socialists don't have precious few gains to point to anywhere. So we should so we can't really point to one strategy over the other as better. And I just think that's not true. The working class has made huge gains. I would actually argue that almost every major gain that workers have across the world, where we talk about the existence of democracy, the existence of a welfare state, the right to have healthcare, the right to have your kids not die in poverty. While this is still far from universal, it is the working class has won, significant gains. The working class of today, because of struggles of workers and socialist organizations, is in a better place in many countries of the world than it was in 1905. And that's great. We should own that. We need to own that forthrightly and not say, everything is was for naught if we don't get to the socialist revolution we need. And so that poses the question that workers have more to lose these days than just their chains. And there's a reason why the dynamics then are somewhat more institutional than they were in autocratic Russia. And we need to own those wins that have been won: healthcare, literacy, the end of the worst parts of patriarchal rule, universal suffrage. Or even the more moderate things like the Lula government, for all of its problems, did significantly lower poverty. Like those are gains that we need to be able to own and win and say the workers' movement and struggle on those. And then we need to figure out how to build off of those in the fight for socialism. I don't think the socialism is going to be built through just things getting worse and worse. And I just think we're going to be in a better position if we're able to build off of the gains that have been made, both strong organizations, public services, decommodification. And then the question is, how do you move from that to a rupture with capitalism? But again, I'll just point the examples that were raised in every single one of these places where there's mass upsurges, workers themselves, David mentioned, Chile, Colombia, India, workers themselves, particularly in the first two, then turned to try to elect a left government because they saw through struggle that they needed to have governance. And so unless we have an answer to governance short of socialist revolution, to me, this is what the question is. We are not going to be able to have answers for the majority that is looking to use these institutions.
Okay, thank you all. So we have another batch of questions, and I'll read them out seriatim. It's another 4. Actually, maybe 5. Actually 5, yes. Okay. So first, are there any online reading groups that meet regularly? I'm assuming about Luxembourg. Secondly, does a single working class party seem anachronistic in our day? Perhaps the Brazilian Workers' Party led by Lula comes closest. Third, in questions for Isabel and Eric, I would like to comment on Luxemburg accused the Polish Socialist Party of dogmatism. Luxemburg was a dogmatic leader of her own Polish party, the SDK-PIL. See also Stanislaw Gott's resignation that's discussed in Eric's book. Fourth, here's a spicy one. This is not me speaking. This is the question, the comment question. Here's a spicy one. To all the panelists but Eric, do you agree with Eric's reformist perspective that rejects mass strikes and other upsurges as the basis of revolution and looks to elections? Fifth, question posed. There have been a lot of cases where mass movements have ousted political leaders and sometimes regimes, Argentina 20 years ago, 2011, 2014, etc., plus some David mentioned. But how do we get to the second negation where the capitalist system gets uprooted, with emphasis on how and on content of movement? And then lastly, what about Rosa's views on imperialism and the peripheries? So that gives us a lot to chew on, folks. You mind if I jump in and take a stab at one of them, and also perhaps give me a chance to respond to Isabel's question? Okay. I certainly agree with Eric that there's huge differences between what the political context in which Luxemburg was operating and ourselves today. I think the biggest, however, difference is that socialism was not a problematical concept within the left and within society as a whole in Luxemburg's time. It is today. Mm-hmm. In Luxemburg's time, it was just kind of taken for granted. Well, what is socialism? Socialism is the abolition of private property as means of production. It's the abolition of market anarchy. It's replacement by planned production. It's nationalized property instead of, or perhaps collectivized property in some form instead of a privatization. Well, that's not an adequate understanding of socialism today after the experience of the 20th century, where we've had numerous regimes that have abolished private property and the free market, and erected regimes, which Luxemburg would certainly, I think, agree with, were tyrannical and completely non-viable. And I don't have to mention names here. It's pretty obvious what they were. Today, the idea of socialism is extremely problematical. It's not clear even what it is. And I think that's a general conception around the world. Now, we could fall back on a very thin understanding of socialism as an enhanced welfare state. But that you can have an enhanced welfare state, but still have it be dominated by the capitalist law of value and not have made a real exit from capitalist social relations, let alone dealing with the fundamental questions of racism, sexism, homophobia, of course, that have become issues of much greater prominence today than they were in Luxemburg's time. So it seems to me that, I mean, one reason I'm so invested in this project is part of the task to resurrect a viable concept of socialism. Because if we don't have that, movements don't really have a real revolutionary direction. It's not the party that we need to lead the revolution to success. We've seen a lot of that over the years. But there has to be some kind of viable concept of an alternative to capitalism that remains largely unarticulated, even though there's elements of it that are clearly been developed to some degree in a scattered kind of way. And that's where my investment in this project is Luxemburg, while she can't answer that question because she was in the historical limitations of the time that I'm describing, nevertheless, it has this vision of emancipation that I think transcends the time she's living in many respects. And there's much we can draw from Luxemburg to build this project of developing at least a conceptual alternative, a vision of some sort that can give direction to struggles. The second point that I would just quickly make here is that, well, too quickly, in response to one of the questions that's posed here, is where I think the problem lies with the electoral approach, and of course it also applies in certain ways to the revolutionary approach, but especially to the electoral one, is it's very clear that the ruling elite will not give up power willingly. If Lula could be chased from power the way he was a few years ago, who was hardly a revolutionary socialist, but did important reforms, and the viciousness of the right, including in this country. If we got a parliamentary majority, I don't have any doubt in my mind that there would be an effort to, violence would be, blood would be flowing in the streets from the right wing to try to prevent that from happening. And if it did happen, to shut it down. So that brings back to the question of organization. How does one prepare for that almost inevitability of the counter-revolution? And I think that, Isabel, is where I wouldn't say I agree with Guérin, because I think her critique of anarchism was actually appropriate in many respects because of its de-emphasis on the question of organization. But when you look at something like Occupy, it was a great experience and a great opening of ideas as well as political activism, raising the question of inequality on the table in a way we haven't seen in a long time. But horizontalism is fine, but there has to be something that can continue beyond that kind of an event, and that was not present in Occupy, and its energies got dissipated, and horizontalism almost became a kind of fetishism. And so these are all kinds of. But for me, the question of organization comes back primarily, however, because revolts will arise, like Black Lives Matter. There's amazing revolt. But the question that still remains unresolved is, what are we for? And what's the real alternative to the system? Sorry if that took too long, but anyway, who wants to jump in now? David?
Thank you, Peter. And really, I'm going to reply a little bit to Eric by way of coming back to one of the first questions, which is the question about reforms. Because, I think it's unfortunate, Eric suggesting that if I say that nobody has a great success to point to in terms of the victory of socialism, to be accused, therefore, of not either supporting or seeing the significance of huge amounts of gains that working class people have made within the system. And that's, of course, exactly the point I was making from the Luxemburg quote, that there is this always a tension internal to the movement between enhancing its organization as a member of civil society and being its gravedigger. Like everybody who's been an active Marxist for years and years, I spend most of my time in reform struggles. I've been an elected person in a couple of different unions, led strikes. I, involved in anti-racist campaigns, pro-choice campaigns, so on and so forth. These are all reforms. And of course, that is what all of us do most of the time who are engaged in fighting against the system. But Luxemburg's contribution, and Laurie referred to this, to the writing, Social Reform or Social Revolution earlier, is to say that the debate is not over reforms. That is not the debate between the right and the left within the working class and socialist movement. Luxemburg's 100% clear on this. She says the debate is over the nature of the struggle for reforms, and that the Marxist left emphasizes the reforms not simply as an end in themselves. Of course, we want enhanced healthcare. Of course, we want better labor laws. Of course, we want the right to choose. Of course, we want affirmative action, and so on and so forth. All of this we're for. But Luxemburg argues that the key thing for the socialist left is the method of struggle for reforms. Are we simply passively appealing to rulers from on high to do the right things for us, simply signing petitions, turning out to vote, and so on? Or are we actually building mass movements of struggle from below for reforms that have a capacity to go beyond the reform themselves? That the nature of the self-organization, the nature of the insurgency of the struggle begins to broaden out horizons and point in a new direction. That is the point of rupture, and Eric appropriately used the term rupture. And so the issue is not that some realists support reforms and some crazed revolutionaries oppose reforms. There's simply no debate there. The question is about a relationship between the struggle for reforms and a rupture with the system. And do we envision a possibility of huge mass insurgent struggles that begin to generate a capacity for the kind of self-organization that Luxemburg saw in the mass strikes of 1905? I still believe that this is the only viable road to any real socialist transformation. I may be wrong. History may prove that this was an empty dream, but I don't see the evidence that the electoralist road has any great victories of establishing socialism. That's my point, of establishing socialism in the ways that Peter was talking about it, the disalienation of social life, the recovery of the means of production by the working class, the overcoming of all forms of gender, racial, sexual oppressions, and so on. And so, to me, this was really my challenge to Eric, it's not that there's one route that's failed. In fact, the socialist left has confronted an impasse I simply assert that the writings of Luxemburg and the spirit of the writings of Luxemburg are indispensable to the reconstitution of a genuine revolutionary socialist movement today. There are no guarantees we win. And in the meantime, we struggle to defend everything we can on behalf of working class and oppressed people. But we try to do so, I think, as Luxemburg said, in a way that actually enhances, builds the capacities of working class people to fight for themselves in ways that might make possible really significant ruptures with the ordinary ways of doing politics.
Who's next?
I can answer about the PT in Brazil. The question about the PT, but the Workers' Party in Brazil. This is another thing. The Brazilian Workers' Party. We cannot say, I don't know in English how we can say this in Portuguese. This is very clear. When we say Partido Único, this was the Stalinist party in the Soviet Union, for instance. Only a party for the whole class. This is not the Brazilian Workers' Party. The Brazilian Workers' Party is a party splitted into itself. This is this party has a lot of wings and so on, and then this is not this idea from a single party and bureaucratic and centralized and so on. This is another thing. Then I don't think we have in West a party like the unique part or the single working party that Rosa Luxemburg criticizes. And I think she was very what we can say, avant la lettre. It was a critique before the time. And for me, it is very, very interesting in Rosa Luxemburg. And I agree with you, David. I think we have no, we are not sure about nothing today, but the only idea I'm sure is we need a class, a popular movement. And here in Latin America, our hope is in the popular movements, only that, not in the parties. The parties, okay, the Workers' Party in this moment in Brazil, Lula, I think Lula is most important than the Workers' Party now for us in Brazil. But we cannot see a future without these popular movements in action. They can create something else, they can, but we have no answer. Okay, but we have to be with these movements. This is my only certitude now. Okay.
So I'll jump in real quick. First on Luxembourg and Poland. It's too long a question, but I'll just say that one of the good things about the upcoming volumes coming out is that it will make clear how extremely dogmatic Luxemburg was in relation to her opponents within the Polish Marxist movement, particularly on the PPS left. And so this is who are other Marxists and not, nationalists or reformists. And so I just flag that that's something to look out for. Her role in the Polish movement, I think, has been totally underestimated how negative it was, and something I deal with in my book if you want like a sneak peek. But fortunately, you can read it for yourself. So it's worth checking that out. And then just a few brief replies. So Yeah, my suggestion wasn't that revolutionary socialists don't care about reforms, but rather that there's a tension that is unacknowledged between taking that approach and being the most effective fighter of reforms and socialism. It's easy to say, well, we're the best fighters of reforms. So for us, it's the best of both worlds. We're both going to be the best winning, struggles for the now and for revolution. But that's just not been the case. Actually, the majority of gains, and this is what I was trying to say before, the majority of gains that have been won have not been primarily led by revolutionary socialists or just through disruptive mass action, but have relied, and there's just a huge amount of scholarship on this, and I think the historical record is pretty clear, on people who are somewhat more moderate, social democrats, democratic socialists. So there's a tension that I don't believe that Luxemburg acknowledged or that David acknowledges between actually being the best fighter for reforms and hewing to a vision of a strategic emphasis purely on primarily on mass struggle from below, and not combining that strategically with a focus on governance and combining that. I'm not arguing just for governance, but there's a tension there. And that when you actually prioritize the fight for winning reforms as a mechanism and fighting with your conception, we need to do this and fight for socialism, that leads you into all sorts of tensions and dilemmas that just the socialist movement has to sort of pass through. And so my contention is pretty clear. It's just to be really explicit, is that we have to be the best fighter of reforms. That's not just going to be through disruptive mass action. It's also going to require a much more of a focus on electoral politics than I think Luxemburg would have countenanced. And therefore, eschewing what is pragmatic for winning real gains for workers today is neither a path towards winning socialism, because workers in their majority will never follow us unless we're actually in practice being the best fighters for them in the day-to-day. And I don't even think materially it's setting the basis for socialism, because I do think that there's a relationship between the fact that you've decommodified huge parts of the economy. Still, the welfare state is a decommodification of huge parts of the economy. I think that's a basis. Doesn't mean we're under socialism, but that's a building block that we can leap off of. That's going to put us in a better position to win socialism when time comes, rather than completely market authoritarian society. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Okay. Laurie? I think you're still muted.
Yeah, technical difficulties. I'm not completely sure how to wade into that debate, because I do see, and I kind of alluded to it earlier, that historical conditions have changed so drastically since Rosa Luxemburg's time. That doesn't mean that her critique ceases to be relevant. I think her critique is still very relevant. I just don't know that the position of the working class is as clear as it was then, despite what David correctly points out is it's not a homogeneous group. I'm thinking of, maybe this is a bit wild, but I come from Winnipeg, and in 1919, Winnipeg had a general strike. And that general strike is still part of the collective memory of people who live in Winnipeg. Right-wing politics notwithstanding, there's still memorials to the 1919 strike. There's still conversations about the fact that the police went out. The only way that strike got quashed was to bring in outside police forces. The Northwest Mounted Police had to come in and crack heads. So this, I don't imagine, can happen again, although I still see it as part of our collective memory. And again, I think I want to reference David's comments. That particular strike was made up not just, I mean, it initially started with trade union workers going out, but it snowballed, and participants in that strike were non-workers, as well as the police who went out. So can we have something like that again in the 21st century? Am I asking a really foolish question? I hope not. But conditions have seriously changed. And I think that right now, when you have someone like Donald Trump pulling the vote from from what should have been the supporters of socialist parties, because he's got a critique, however woolly-minded and crazy it is, of globalization, then we're doing something wrong. And I think Ernst Bloch understood this in the German Revolution when he commented about the KPD. What they did before the advent of fascism was correct, it's what they did after that was wrong. And I think that message for me still resonates now as more of a contemporary thing from that period. I hope I'm not just rambling. So that's my intervention on that question.
Well, thank you, Laurie, and thank you to all of our panelists. We're running to the deadline of our time here. But I want to thank you all, as well as our audience, for posing some really great questions. And for those of you who didn't hear from, we're looking forward to hearing from you in the future. Just want to mention a couple of things in passing. Is one of the questions was about Luxemburg's writings on the non-Western world and the periphery. Volume 1 of the complete works has what were previously unavailable in English, a whole series of manuscripts, including the full text of her book, Introduction to Political Economy, which contains hundreds of pages of her writings on the analyses of indigenous communal formations in the non-Western world and such, and her critiques of imperialism within the context of those writings. So volume 1 is still in print, and it will be for a while, I hope. And you can get that there. I should also, in reference to the question on China, there is a complete works of Rosa Luxemburg project, in large part inspired by the English edition, being produced in China. Volume 1 came out last year. So there is interest of Rosa Luxemburg in China. Of course, one of the things that makes it a very pertinent issue is Luxemburg did hold, as did all the serious Marxists of her generation, that a democratic republic is the necessary condition, or the best necessary condition, the best of the various options for conducting the class struggle to a successful conclusion. That certainly has some relevance to there. And lastly, one of the points that was made very early on in the questions, which we didn't get to, is there any reading groups out there on Luxemburg? We certainly hope that this would inspire. If those who are interested, please contact the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung or myself directly. You can find my email pretty easily. It's phudis@oakton.edu, OAKTON. If you're interested in continuous discussions on the collected works, or more generally on Luxemburg or in other aspects of revolutionary theory, certainly there's bound to be many more opportunities coming up. So thank you all very much for your participation, and we look forward to the discussion and, of course, debate within that continuing.